Good morning and afternoon, everyone. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Excellent. So I'm seeing we have 9 people in. I'm going to wait a couple of minutes for people to pop in. Okay. Pop hedge doc out. Sorry, it's a bit early here in California. I'm visiting the mothership this week, so this is breakfast. All right, let me pull up the agenda. So I will go ahead and get started with the introduction from the chair. Hi, I am Brian Trammell. I am one of the 2 co-chairs of PANRG. Jen Linkova, my co-chair, was unable to attend today, so I will be running this meeting on my own. I will be sort of tracking some of the discussion into the hedge doc, but so it's like the little note-taking tool icon on the thing. If there are other people who are in attendance who could help me out there, I would very much appreciate it. For some reason, I don't have access. I'm not getting the actual markdown. The markdown is rendered when you look at it on the data tracker. That is possibly a issue to file with the tools team, but we will muddle along. So today we are talking primarily, exclusively, about progress on the Scion drafts and the discussion around like how best to engage with that. We will start with an update to the Scion component analysis draft. So this we discussed in Philadelphia and remotely and in the interim before. And then we will dive into a focus on the PKI components, right? So if you recall from the last time, the feedback from the last meeting was there seemed to be 3 major components here in Scion, pulling things together. Yes, the room is in use. Pulling things together, like trying to standardize the whole thing as once is not going to work very well in the IETF context. We think these are the 3 components. Let's actually get into them. So like then we'll talk about updates to that draft, and then we'll get into the first component, which is sort of the PKI. Are there any bashes to the agenda? Anyone like to talk about something else? Going once, going twice. Okay, then without further ado, Scion component analysis. Nicola, are you going to speak to that one?
Yeah. Hey,
Excellent.
Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You can go ahead and grab the presentation tools.
I think on Meet.echo it tells me that there's no slides. I'm not sure if you need to like reload them, or if not, I'll share my screen.
Reload meeting materials. Yes, there they are. So try again.
Oh, okay, yeah, now it appeared.
Yep.
Okay, here we are. No, nice. I think you probably have to, I'm not sure, I cannot share them. If I click, it just opens the PDF.
I have passed slides control to you.
Oh, okay, now, yes, now I got it. All right. Do you now see the slides?
Yes. Take it away.
How do I? Oh, okay, yeah, I was missing the slides and somehow they're still not coming up. But anyways, I'll get started and see if they come up at some point. Let me see. It's weird because I don't even see the slides control. Like in the slides, in the presentation view.
You are controlling the slides. We are now on the second slide.
Okay, no, but I cannot see them, so I don't know. I think something got stuck in my. Let me try to rejoin. I think something got stuck in my browser because I see the controls, but I don't see the slides.
I am seeing that you are actually controlling the slides. Okay.
Can you grab slide control again, or do I still have it?
Yes.
Okay, and okay, now I see them.
Good.
Thank you. I think something got.
Turn it off and back on again. Excellent.
All right, cool. Then let's get started. So first, thanks a lot, Brian, for the introduction. So this is Nico. I guess, yeah, you already know me from the previous presentations if you were attending. So in this session, we are presenting updates to the component analysis draft that Brian mentioned. So just to summarize where we stand as of today, well, we started bringing more of Scion to the IETF in general back in Vienna. So we had an initial discussion at IDR and at the side meeting, and we were invited kindly by the chairs at PANRG to also bring some of the work into the group. And this is why in the last interim that we had back in June, we presented an initial overview draft that is meant to give you a rough idea of what Scion is, what it does. As Brian mentioned, there were many questions about this system. We wanted to decompose the system into components, and that's why we prepared this component analysis that we have been updating. And in the end, as mentioned before, then we will look at one of the components, which is the Pki. I'm kind of assuming that if you are here, you already heard about Scion, so I will not say too much. Just remember, it is this path-aware interdomain architecture. Its focus is on availability, security, and scalability, especially when it comes to having adversaries in your network. It is deployed in production, especially here in Switzerland. We have the banking ecosystem that communicates over Scion. I see that we also have a member of one of the ISPs that run Scion here in the audience. So thank you for joining, Simon. Well, so I will not say too much more about Scion. If you want to know more, please look at the overview draft that is also linked in this slide. Moving on to the components, just to recap what we discussed. The architecture, when you deploy Scion in an autonomous system, you have three fundamental components that somehow you must deploy. So going from top to the bottom, we have the Pki that takes care of authentication, certificates, and so on. And this is what Corinne will present later. We have the control plane that basically explores and discovers routing information and disseminates it to the end hosts. And in the end, we have the data plane that does the actual forwarding. So when we presented the system, as I mentioned, we got these questions about what the key components are. Can they be decomposed? Can they be used independently? Are there any protocols that are reused or extended? Why, or if they are not reused or extended, why we are not reusing or extending them. And so that's why we took the initial draft and we tried to address some of the feedback that we got at 114 in Philadelphia. So I think, first of all, people found the IETF presentation a lot clearer in terms of structure and thought organization than the draft. So this is something that we have been doing, especially for each component. We have been trying to clarify what the input-output relationship is between all of these components. In addition to this, I think some of the content related to existing protocols was also, I think there was need to clarify that. So we have also been working on that. So when it comes to the actual draft, what's actually changed? Well, first of all, the overall structure has been heavily modified, and we try to take a more component-specific approach. So we try to look at each component independently, and then for each one of them, we try to look, first of all, at the properties that are provided by these components. And second of all, we look at the input and outputs. So we call this input dependencies, or what each component needs to be able to function. And then we call the outputs what is provided to other components. So what are really the outputs. And ultimately, we also moved the discussion about existing protocols from a general paragraph to have a more component-focused discussion. So each component now has its own discussion about this topic. So when it comes to the actual dependencies, then we also try to summarize this in a very simple graph. I think going from top to bottom, when you look at the control plane Pki that is in charge of doing authentication, we already mentioned that this is the most independent component, and it does not really require that many strong dependencies, in the sense that it requires an initial bootstrapping of trust, which is manifested in the form of a ceremony. It requires some form of communication between the Pki entities, and it requires time synchronization so that you can verify a certificate. And what the Pki does is that it provides cryptographic material to the Scion control plane. This is manifested into two main things. One of it is this AS certificate. So each Scion autonomous system is issued a certificate that is then used to authenticate all the control messages. And Pki also provides a root of trust that is manifested as a TRC. And later today, we will really dig into the details of how this works. When you look at the control plane, it does all the routing. And so the way this is exposed to the lower layer, which is basically the data plane, is by providing these authenticated segments. And in addition to this, there is also somehow error management protocol, which is SCMP, which is somehow similar to ICMP, but it is extended with authentication. And this is used for some kind of data plane error messages, for example, reacting to link failure in some cases. And in the end, when you look at the data plane itself, well, that's the last Scion component. And of course, below the data plane, you also have applications on end hosts that in the end are the ones that are leveraging the path-aware secure communication that is provided by Scion. And so this is something that probably also will require an interface. For example, there were some discussions at TAPS, I think, about how to expose path awareness to transport layer. And so this is also, I think, important to mention this in this draft because it is an important part of the component. I see that Brian raised his hand, so.
I just want to ask a clarifying question here on sort of like the top of this diagram. Like I really like this diagram that sort of like, makes it very clear that we should be spending our time talking about the PKI a little bit later. Like the agenda is correct. Yay. we talk about sort of like applications on the end host, but in the situation where you're using sort of like Scion for network engineering, sort of like for building tunnels, the end host is actually a tunnel endpoint, right? Or the application is the tunnel endpoint. So this is not just like all the way
Yes.
down, like the transition mechanism that's going to be, possibly something that's accepting other packets and encapsulating them. Correct? Yeah. Cool.
Correct.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you.
To be honest, we usually use nhost as a word, but the way that I think personally we should maybe talk about endpoints. I think I like the word better. And to be honest, one of the things that I had in the back of my mind is also at some point to look at the vocabulary of path properties and try to maybe align our draft to that. But I know that there was some work going on that draft as well, so it was just not top of my priorities, let's say. But that is a very good point. All right. So moving on, yeah. This is basically a summary of the dependencies. I think last time we already had quite a discussion about that, so I'm not gonna repeat myself. I do have some slides from the previous discussion as well, if we wanna dig into some of the specific topics, or otherwise, yeah, you can get to the draft. Brian, sorry, I see you're still with your hand raised.
I'm managing the queue poorly, so continue.
Okay. All right. So moving on, one thing that I mentioned is that we restructure the sections that regard relationships to existing protocols. So the idea there is to mention what protocols are reused or how Scion plays with those existing protocols. And in the cases where these are not reused, we try to highlight the differences or the motivation why some protocols are not reused. So when we look at each component individually, starting from the PKI, we describe quickly that it uses X509, so this is somehow reused, built on top of it. But on the other hand, we also discuss why existing PKIs could not be really leveraged without losing some properties. So for example, if you were to use the RPKI, you would miss this concept of isolation domains that is quite fundamental for the Scion PKI in terms of trust model. When it comes to the routing part, we discussed the relationship with existing IGP. So we just reiterate that Scion is interdomain. So Scion basically leaves it open to each autonomous system to decide whatever intradomain routing protocol it is using. We moved the discussion about Lisp there because there are, of course, some similarities and differences. So as with Lisp, Scion is separating this concept of nhost locator and nhost identifier and locator. And this is somewhat similar, but then the way things are implemented, there are some differences. And I think we already talked about that a bit last time. And we also mentioned the relationship with RPKI from a routing perspective, in the sense that some of the Scion extensions that bridge between Scion and IP actually build on top of RPKI in order to authenticate prefix, basically prefix origin when it comes to IP prefixes. When it comes to the data plane, we also mentioned how it interacts with intra-domain forwarding. We also mentioned that in the early deployments, Scion is deployed intra-domain on top of IP UDP, so that it can basically leverage the existing infrastructure quite easily. And in this section, we also moved the discussion about segment routing. I think that was a topic of discussion last time. We did not have time to look deeper at how they could be possibly combined in details, but I think that the concept is still the same as the last time. The two technologies could potentially work, one on the intra domain, and that would be segment routing, and Scion on the interdomain. But how the path awareness properties of each one of them interact is still an open question that we have not investigated in detail. So I think that's that's mostly it when it comes to the component analysis draft. So we hope that these changes help to make it clear what each component is doing, and also helps us to move forward in discussions about how to move forward. So we would be very happy to get additional feedback also on the draft on specific parts, whether they are clear or not. We would also like to start a bit tasting what is the mood when it comes to potentially doing more work in the group on some of the drafts. So for example, on adopting it. And on this point, I also wanted to remind that we have also this Scion overview draft that we presented in the last interim. And there was some feedback there, but I think it was overall not specifically on the draft, but was more about focusing on this component analysis. So that's why we decided to create this draft that I presented today. But that draft is also something that could potentially deserve some further work. For example, we have a section about deployment and experiences that I think would be handy. We also explain a bit the motivation behind Scion. We give a glimpse of what the components are. So yeah, we would be happy to get some feedback from the group and eventually being able to push some of the draft further.
So I think on that point, I'm noticing that we have 11 people in attendance here today, which is actually a somewhat smaller group than we've had at previous meetings talking about this. So I think I would want to take the question on adoption to the mailing list, and also the question on just sort of like finding reviewers for the document who maybe haven't already seen it. Take that one to the mailing list as well. Obviously, people who are here in the room, if you have not read this document, please do and send comments to the list. But I want a few more eyeballs on it. With my chair hat on, I want a few more eyeballs on it before we issued a formal call for adoption. So, hopefully, we can get a little discussion going on the list between now and London, and we could put that question on the agenda for London. And on the overview draft, I don't. I think the sort of like the component analysis is probably one that we probably would definitely even want to publish, right? Because that sort of like sets up the framework for here's how we think you would split this up in order to engage with it in the IETF. And that's also sort of like a worked example of how you would do new architecture development in the IETF, right? So those are like, as a worked example of how to do this, it actually makes sense to publish as an RG draft. That's an individual opinion. I'd want to also discuss that either here or on the list. The overview document, I think, is probably going to evolve quite a bit as we figure out how to engage with the specific components, right? So things that we're talking about putting into the overview doc might come out into other docs, for example. So that would be maybe one to adopt, and not necessarily with the intent that we're definitely going to publish this in RFC, but maybe as one sort of to continue the discussion as we figure out how to parcel these things out, right? Because the things that feed into the overview doc might then go into their own working groups or into existing working groups or so on and so forth. So whatever gets published in there, I would want to see probably, I would guess probably would be shorter than what's there right now, but it can be sort of like a holding document until we figure out how to split things up. Are there any other opinions in the room? I notice I'm talking a lot.
Maybe, sorry, go ahead, Colin.
I'm just trying to work out remember how to work Meetup. Yeah, I mean, just following up on the discussion of publishing it. I mean, we have to be a little careful because, of course, this is an IETF group, so we can't make recommendations for what the IETF should be doing. A components draft that talks about what are the pieces here, which are the areas which need potentially further research, which are the areas that seem potentially mature enough. That's a separate a separate standardization activity could happen in the IETF. Would seem like a reasonable discussion to set the scene for what's future IETF research, and what isn't in need of future research. But then it's up to the IETF to decide whether that's something it wants to standardize. It's not something where we can say, go ahead and standardize this. We can say, we think this is mature enough for potential standardization. But that's not quite the same recommendation. So we just have to be a little bit careful. But yes, fundamentally, I think I agree with what Brian said.
Good. I will take those for notes, and you can continue. Or is this last slide?
Yeah, no. So I think that's it from my component analysis. I mean, I have similar slides to the ones that we had last time, but I think we had the discussion. So if we want to go into specific topics, we can. But I mean, in terms of presenting, I tried to focus more on the delta. I hope that
exactly.
Just following up on what Colin mentioned, I think what is important for us is to document. I think we already discussed a bit this in Philadelphia. It is important to document what exists today. So the goal would definitely not be aimed for standardization in the short term, but it would be being able to somehow freeze or document what is deployed today, how Scion works in the deployments that are around today. And then I think this could be used for future work as standardization, but I think it would be good to do it in steps. So first get something like this. It could maybe even be an independent draft, or it could be, this is not yet clear. So
Colin has probably jumped in to give the advice that I was about to give, so I will let Colin give that advice because I've been talking a lot. So
I'm very happy to let you give the advice and see if we match.
Yeah. So, like the documenting what is done today as sort of the basis for sort of future standardization or future work in a research group, as you alluded to, is pretty much exactly one of the functions of the independent submissions stream, right? Like, so it seems a lot like so that would be an alternate way to engage with the overview if you actually take the overview document and build it out with the existing component overview, not with an eye toward decomposition, but with an eye toward just like, here's what we built, and with the deployment models and experiences, and you say like, ETH and ETH Anapaya and the Scion Foundation's implementation of Scion, right? And I think that the content in the document right now is a pretty good start on that, and like that is pretty well established practice. That is one of the things that the IET or that the independent submission stream is for. Is here is a informatively referenceable thing that says what we did, and then you can talk about deltas to that and any of the changes that that get adopted in the IETF or that we adopt as research here in PANRG. And you can also just use those as a baseline and as examples of in future IETF discussions of, yes, here is why we think this will work because of this deployment information. So I think it is useful to build that document out, but like that clearly belongs, my opinion, in the independent submission stream. Let's see if Colin agrees with me.
Yeah, I think I do. Sort of describing what you have deployed now is a reasonable goal for the independent stream. If you want to standardize it, the IETF will want to take change control and will almost certainly make significant changes, because I've never yet seen the IETF just rubber stamp a protocol and not make significant changes when it does this. And so you'll end up with something that probably looks quite different by the time the IETF is finished with it. And on the IRTF side, I think that the focus would have to be identifying the areas where there's new things to learn, perhaps to make it scale, or I don't know. I'm not familiar with it enough to know exactly what those would be. and we'd be identifying the areas where more research is needed for the IETF side of things. So yeah.
Good, good. Any other discussion? Go ahead, Nicola.
Yeah, just following up on that, maybe after the next presentation, when we look at one of the components, then we can pick up this discussion. And I would have a question, but I think it's better if we answer later, whether it would be, whether a detailed component description like the PKI would be a better candidate for an independent submission, or whether it would be more the component analysis. But I would say let's go through the presentation first, and then we can pick this up.
I agree. That sounds like a good idea. So I think with that, is Corinne going to do the next presentation? Excellent. So I will pass slides control. Maybe. There we go.
This one. Okay, it's there. Do you see it?
Yes, I do. And do you see it is the more important question.
I can see it, and I
Excellent.
can
Good.
also, I think, yeah, go to the next slide. Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
So welcome, everybody. Thank you for your presentation, Nicola, and also thank PANRG for inviting us again. As Nicola already announced, I'm going to introduce the Scion control plane Pki a little bit. I mean, it's a bit more detailed than just the overview of all the components, but it's also, of course, not very detailed, very specified in the end. It's just more like a summary of the draft I submitted 2 weeks ago. Oh, I can go here. Okay. So as Nicola already said, and you now in the meantime probably already know, Scion is interdomain internet architecture, path-aware internet architecture. It is all about routing, interdomain routing, multipath routes are supported, and when routing, it focuses on availability, security, and scalability. But the question is, how can you be sure that Scion's routing information is authentic and trustworthy? Because as we all know, the internet is not such a safe place. Parties are inherently distrustful. Yeah, how can we be sure that information is really Scion information? And for this, the requirement is that the integrity and the authenticity of the control plane messages and path segments should be verifiable. And for this, we have set up an authentication mechanism which is based on the public key infrastructure. And the purpose of the Scion control plane Pki is providing a mechanism to distribute and authenticate the public keys which are used to verify control plane messages. So now I have to, oh yes, so we set up our own control plane Pki, and when doing this, we try to meet the following requirements. It was important that there is it is resilient to a root of trust compromise, especially also single root of trust compromise. And when there would be something would be compromised, a quick recovery must be possible. We also want to have multilateral government, not one single body or entity. There must be support for versioning and updates. And that should be a flexible trust model, what means that entities can select which trust routes they need to rely upon, which trust routes they trust or yeah. So what would be ideal would be that the trust architecture allows multiple mutual trusting parties to form their own trust bond, and also to decide freely whom they want to trust outside of this trust bubble. And another requirement is also that the whole system remains highly available. So the PKI infrastructure architecture should work also without being dependent on communication with PKI servers. And this requirement is there to avoid cyclic dependency between routing updates and PKI operation. And with this in mind, Scion has this isolation domains approach where they think can tackle these issues or meet requirements I mentioned before. And well, you may have known or heard of them now in the meantime. Isolation domains are a logical grouping of ASs that share a uniform trust environment, like a common jurisdiction. Here you see some ISDs. They are building blocks to achieve high availability and scalability, support for heterogeneous trust. And then each isolation domain is administrated by several core ASs. These are these bytes, circles within the ISDs. And these core ISDs, they negotiate a trust policy or a contract, which is called a trust root configuration, and which is valid for this specific ISD. And also important to mention is that the certificate authentications authorities in an ISD can only create certificates for the ASs in this respective ISD. And we think that the Scion control plane makes it different if you compare it with other PKI models, because we have no omnipotent trust root or certification authority. And what is also quite special is that this trust contract, which is valid for one ISD, and its updates must be approved by a special voting mechanism, which includes more than one voting party. So this prevents one single party to compromise the entire ISD. And it also enables multilateral government. We also hope that it enables trust agility, because users are free to select an isolation for internet service provider, which is an AS. And an AS which uses Scion is part of an isolation domain. And so because of this, users can select, say, the internet service provider they want to join, and they, in a way, can there, with this, select which route they trust. And then the members of an isolation domain can also freely decide which other isolation domain they want to trust additionally. So I already mentioned this trust root configuration, this kind of trust contract. This is the trust anchor of the isolation domain. And because it holds the root certificates of the isolation domain's chain of trust, it also facilitates the validation of bindings between ASs, names, and public keys. And it bootstraps authentication within an isolation domain. And this happens in a special signing ceremony where the base trust root configuration is created. And it also is a means to efficiently revoke compromised roots of trust. So this is some kind of graphic of this trust root configuration. And it's basically a collection of root certificates, which are X509 format certificates, version 3, self-signed. There are also so-called voting certificates. Then it also includes the trust policy, in a way, the parameters that set the trust policy of the isolation domain, like, for instance, the validity period of this trust root configuration, the grace period, which is the period during which two trust root configurations are valid, it sets the core ASs of the trust, no, not the trust root, but the isolation domain, and several more parameters. As I already said, the first trust root configuration in ISD is called the base TRC, but it is possible to update these TRCs. And these updates, again, must be signed by designating ASs, which we call the voting ASs. And this is all described in more detail in the draft, which has been submitted a couple of weeks ago. So the TRC bootstraps, in a way, the chain of trust, or is at the root of the chain of trust of an isolation domain. We have the root certificates, which are part of this trust root configuration. They are needed, they are used to sign the CA certificates, and these CA sign how do you say it? These certificates are used to verify these other certificates, but the corresponding private keys are used to sign these certificates. So the root private key signs the CA certificate, and the CA private key is used to sign the AS certificate, and then the other way around, the public keys are used to verify these certificates. And then the ASs, they sign the control plane messages. They use their private key for that. And if you want to verify these control plane messages, you need the corresponding AS certificate. So this is very, very shortly the chain of trust within an ISD. So in a way, you can see the whole this whole trust concept as some kind of function. It is scoped on ISD level, and it transforms, in a way, the potential distrust or possible distrust among different parties into a mutually accepted trust bond. And it is important to mention that not all member ASs do need to trust each other, but they should trust the core ASs of an ISD, the ISD's certification authorities, and the voting ASs. And here you see also graphically this function graphically displayed, like input are these policy parameters and the required keys and certificate. The function is, in a way, the bootstrapping, and then later on the update procedures, and the outputs are the trust contract TRC, or the updates of it, and the AS certificates. These certificates, they are all, oh yes, sorry, yes, Brian? I see you raise a hand.
Yeah, I did. So pop back to the last slide real quick. So like thanks. There's the set of entities that need to be trusted by any member AS. These entities don't necessarily each have their own sort of like organization or corporate entity in sort of like the world, right? Like, so you might have like the set of core ASs and the CAs might be the same sort of, like we'd say, administrative domain, or might be the same sort of corporate entity, or you might have this structure doesn't necessarily have to overlay the organizational structure of how all of this is set up, right? Like, because there's the cryptographic question of like who has the material to be able to sign a thing. But then there's also sort of like the organizational structure of who can tell the people to sign things, right? Like, and how do we get into like the question of what the organizational structure would have to look like in order to make the sort of the paths of trust work, or is that like a question that's out of scope at this time?
It is not, as in detail, it is not part of this presentation, but it is the CAs especially, they, how do you say it? They can be ASs, which are a member of the okay. ISD, but they can also, it can also be outsourced.
Right, because like when you get into sort of like, you know, specifying how this is going to work, if you compare this, for example, to the RPKI, right? The RPKI has a set of protocols, but it also has a set of practices and procedures at the RIRs, and those are also important for the general trustworthiness of the arrangement. So that's probably a different document. I just wanted to raise it as
there is especially in the draft, there is a bit more in more detail described how this signing ceremony should be set up. And but there is also Scion also explicitly leaves the members of the ISD some freedom in how they organize, how they set this up, and also how do you say this? Who are the voting ASs? Who are the core ASs? That's something ISDs have to make this up among themselves.
So so the organizational, the interface between this and the organizational governance shows up in the signing syrup. I'll take a closer look at the signing ceremony.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you
very
much.
Yes. So that's. Can I continue? Okay, good. So, about the certificates, they are, as I said already, they are X509 version 3 format, and based on this RFC 5280. And you already saw there are 3 kind of control plane certificates: root certificates, CA certificates, and AS certificates, and they build the verification chain. Then separate of this, there are the voting certificates. You have regular voting certificates, and they are used to verify regular periodic updates of TRCs without important changes in core entities or policies. So this is more like if a root certificate or a voting certificate expires and has to be replaced by a new one. But in case there are really changes in the set of core ASs, for instance, or if one root key is compromised, it can be possible to there might be a sensitive update where you really replace a specific certificate, and this is called a sensitive update, and for this you need the sensitive voting certificate, and these details are all again described in the draft. And then, of course, if you have certificates, they also maybe can be revoked, and this is also enabled by the control plane Pki. And this is very shortly how a compromised certificates in Scion can be revoked. For the root certificate, voting certificate, or core AS certificates, this happens through updating the TRC. And if too many certificates of this kind of certificates are compromised, it is even possible that a TRC trust reset may be needed. And this, I come back to this a bit later on. But the CA certificates and also the non-core AS certificates, they are in a way automatically revoked because they are short-lived certificates which only live for 11 respectively 3 days, and then they are reissued again. So this is in a way how they are revoked. And in Scion, there is no revocation list. The revoked certificates are meant to be discovered via the Scion pass exploration process. And of course, end hosts or points are not, they do not only communicate with ASs in their own ISD, but they also communicate with other ASs, or maybe are even also part of other ISDs. So they need access to all these TRCs of all the entities in ISDs they communicate with. And the question is, of course, how do they obtain these TRCs of these neighboring ISDs or relying parties? And at the moment, in the real life implementation, this happens manually. So the operators of an ISD, they really can receive new or updated TRCs through multiple channels, like really out-of-band mechanisms, but also maybe that they discover updated TRCs via pass exploration. And what they do is that they add these new updated TRCs in the trust store manually. But we hope in the future to implement an automatic discovery mechanism, which again is based on Scion's past exploration and resolution method. I do not go in details very much into this past exploration and resolution methods now. This will be part of the, if there will be another draft about the control plane. And you can also, it's a bit more explained also in the draft. So what is a TRC life cycle? First, we have this bootstrapping of trust in an ISD, where the first initial base TRC of an ISD is actually created. This is an in-person signing ceremony, and the participants are representative of the ISD's voting ASs, a ceremony administrator, and a neutral witness. And they have, in advance of this signing ceremony, they have to agree upon these parameters, which sets the policy, the trust policy of an ISD. They also have to agree on the set of root certificates, and of course also what you were talking about, Brian, also in itself on the organization of this public key, this infrastructure in itself. So who will be voting? Who will be voting AS? Who will be a certification authority, core AS, things like that? It is assumed that this is how do you say it, negotiated in advance before this bootstrapping of trust ceremony. What happens in the very first this signing ceremony is that also the number of the ISD is selected. And then there are 4 phases of this ceremony. First is that certificates which are part of the TRC are exchanged. That is not, of course, the certificates, the public key, not the private keys. Then the payload of the TRC is generated. Then the parties which are present sign the TRC, and then it is validated. And if all of this has been has been passed, then it is distributed out of band throughout the ISD. And so it is also like this is not something which is really fixed. Every ISD can set up this ceremony itself, like the way they like it. But of course, it should be more or less along these lines. And of course, the TRC itself, how it should look like, is defined. It's also written in this draft. So in the output of this ceremony should be a valid TRC. And then also for TRC updates, especially sensitive updates, you can, it's up to the ISDs whether they will create another in-person ceremony or if they do this automatically. These aspects are a bit, we give the ISD a little bit freedom in how they do this. Then the other thing is, of course, how do all the member parties find out that TRC are updated? First, they are usually updated, as I already said, that when a root or voting certificate expires and is replaced, so just a regular update. And then it can also be necessary to update a TRC when one root key is compromised, or when there is, for instance, a change in core ASs. But if in very, very catastrophe situations or really serious situations when where so many keys are compromised that it is not possible anymore to vote for an updated TRC, it might be needed to really totally revoke a TRC and reset it. This is called trust reset. And this is also something which an ISD or the members of the ISD have to decide in the beginning already, whether they allow this or not. So it can be, you can set as one of the parameters, you can define a no trust reset, parameter, and really explicitly say we do not want to have a trust reset because it's too much of a hassle and too much of risk. But suppose it happens, then a new base TRC is created. And because this is really a trust reset, it cannot be verified with certificates which were in the previous TRC. So this again, this new base TRC must be axiomatically trusted. And then it also must be distributed out of band. And how are these updated or even resetted TRC discovered? This again is via this path exploration and path resolution mechanisms Scion offers. And this is very, very shortly how it works. There is a new TRC which is signed by a number of votes defined in the previous TRC. And then the number of this new TRC, the IDs of this new TRC is announced in Science control plane messages. And if an AAS then discovers that it does not have this new TRC because the TRC it has, the number is lower than the one of the new one, it can fetch it. It can ask for it. It can ask the, how do you say this, the AS that sent the control plane message to get the new TRC. And through this mechanism, the new TRC with the new trust routes propagates quite rapidly through the network. So really within minutes or yeah, in maybe in a bad case in hours. But this goes very fast, or relatively fast, maybe. So now I have explained a little bit in theory how this works, but it's not only a theory; it is really also already deployed. We have already 2 industry-grade implementations in Switzerland. One is so this the control plane Pki is how do you say it is in use by the main financial infrastructure and service provider of Switzerland, the SIX Group. And if you click on this link, it goes to a page of SIX where they explain how they use it. And then there is another implementation which is based on the HashiCorp Vault. And the Scion implementation company, Anapaya, has also a website where they explain how this works. So if you, I don't know, the slides are available, I think, afterwards. People who are interested in this, they can then click these links and have a look at it, how it works.
Yeah, these are all in the meeting materials. So
okay, yes. And there is also an open source implementation in our so-called Scion Proto, what is it, open source, yes, Scion Lab installation. And there you can also have a look, and there you can also see how it is implemented there. So it really, it works. Yes, Brian? You raise your hand?
Question, we have like 3 different implementations. Do these interoperate with each other? Like, as I understand it, sort of like the Scion lab and the industrial code bases are not yet, or at least the last I looked, were not yet sort of aligned with each other. Are these implementations of the same protocol, or are they worked examples that this approach to doing trust route configuration works? Like, could I build something with Scion Proto and connect to SIX Group, assuming that they would, allow
Nicola,
me to?
You also raise your hand, maybe?
Yeah, I wanted to chime in on this. As far as I'm aware, I think the basic layer is currently interoperable, but I think there might be some extensions that are not part of the core PKI that are not equally deployed. So some of the extensions are only deployed on the experimental research network in lab, but not on the productive one. Okay,
cool. So these are theoretically mostly interoperable independent implementations, but yes, at the edges not. Okay, that's cool. Thank you for the answer.
Yeah, so but it's an interesting point, definitely. I mean, okay, so now I'm already coming to the end of the presentation, which, as I already said, is really a summary of what is explained in the drafts. I mean, Nicola also said it, and there was already already in discussion that we have now these 3 active drafts, and we are just thinking what would be the next steps into the possible adoption process, and well, we already discussed this a bit. So maybe now that I don't know if anybody has seen the draft itself. I mean, this was only the presentation, but this could maybe also be, for instance, something which could go in the independent submission stream. I don't know, but so this is something we are really, you realize, because also Nicola had this question. We just are figuring out how we can continue from now on. Yes, and thank you very much for your attention. And if there are questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Maybe first on the PKI itself, the control plane PKI, and then also maybe we can discuss a bit further these things we already discussed with Nicola. Okay.
The queue is open. Questions, discussion, clarifying anything. Karsten.
Yeah, this has already been said, just not by me. The word adoption here is really confusing, and there are very different things that can be done by an adoption. And in a research group, adoption essentially means that the research group thinks this is interesting stuff. It doesn't mean that anything is good or works or could be the basis for a major engineering effort. It's just interesting research. So I wouldn't get my hopes up just because this research group thinks this is interesting stuff. I think that the proof will be in the pudding in the end. I think that the fact that PANRG hasn't been talking about anything for a few months already is an indication that Scion is interesting. So we have already generated that. And how we actually handle the specific documents depends on what we're trying to do. The ISE independent submission part is good for one actor just going ahead and describing what they did. The research group can actually help with getting a more fundamental analysis of what has been done. So that is still something that could be a good research group document. Looking at this PKI stuff, there are certainly models that could be applied for describing what's going on in this PKI draft. And it would be useful to see how these models describe what you are doing. So that might actually be an interesting research group document, which also might help setting up terminology that you can use in the future, which are less confusing than calling everything trust.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because the draft I also we submitted is really was a really very first version, because we were asked to submit something, and we had not so much time. So like things like this, we definitely want to have a section where we some kind of glossary where we define all these terms, which is now. You are totally right. It's not really very specifically defined yet, or described yet, and so that is definitely something we have to work on. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think getting the terminology right is really hard, and that's something that the research group can provide a really good service, because people come together that have very different backgrounds.
Yeah, I think you also, I mean, the point is also that we have this very broad question, because we are just a bit like, I think we are just a bit trying to find out what can be, how can we proceed, because in the end we have 10 drafts or something, and we want to try to continue in a way with some of the things we started now. Yeah. Okay, Brian?
As an individual, I will second Karsten's point. I think that talking about terminology is something that we do very well here, and we can do quite a lot of it. Actually, I was reminded today that we need to get back to our path properties vocabulary document, because it expired. So that will also be on the agenda in London.
Yes, I saw it.
I'm not sure how to do this, but the group of people who sort of showed up in PANRG at the beginning, because of like the work that started off at the beginning, we're very transport protocol oriented people, and we kept doing things like scheduling against routing working group things, and that was not great. And now we do have people from the routing area looking at things, but digging into, I'm not sure that the people who are in the room right now, like, so who generally are, you know, engaging on the PANRG list and showing up in the meetings as well as the interims, are necessarily of a security bent to like really have the most useful input on the terminology. I think that like getting down and being very precise about like how this works and generalizing it a bit, I think that's something that the RG can do very well, but we're going to need to do some outreach and expand the room a little bit in order to do that, right? Looking at the draft as it is right now, like, so like it's sort of a description of what's there. I think if we go the route of you know, adopting it and working on this draft a bit more in the research group before we send it somewhere, it's going to turn into a very different draft, right? Like it's going to be generalization of this approach, because there's a lot that's very specific about, right? So I think the draft makes the case very well about why you can't just sort of lift and shift the RPKI into like a Scion-like network, right? Like this idea of isolation domains is fairly fundamental. And that comes with sort of different ceremonies and existing PKIs. It comes with different actors. You're using a lot of the same sort of presentation layer and application layer concepts, right? You're using X509-3. You have like the formats are interoperable with things that we already have experience with, but the arrangement of the components is different.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that like focusing on bringing this into the research group and talking about sort of like terminology and generalization seems quite interesting. I'd want to have a discussion on, again, we have 11 people here right now. I want to have a broader discussion on the list and then revisit this on the agenda in London. But we really would have to get some security people and interested in coming and hanging out with us to help with that work. Colin.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think that there's definitely scope for an interesting discussion about the different security models and how that and how to interoperate between the different models and what are the trade-offs and so on. I think there's a bunch of interesting research questions there. I'm not sure that's what this current draft is. This seems more of a description of what is implemented now. And I think how to proceed, I think, really depends on what your goal is, right? If your goal is to document what exists now as a set of RFCs, then the independent stream would seem like the right way to do it. If the goal is to understand the broader questions around, in this particular case, the PKI and the security and trust models and so on, then a research group, that's PANRG or one of the others, is something to think about. And if it's to develop a standardized version and perhaps to understand which pieces, how to incorporate some of the trust models that exist in the current internet and how to interwork with them and standardize it and bridge that into the Scion world, then you possibly want some combination of the IETF work and the IRTF work.
This is almost academic in a way.
Sorry, what was that?
That would be almost academical, like research, really, about more like how do you say it? Then you don't think anymore about how it is implemented now, but you are more like it's more like almost on a philosophical level, not of course, but more like really talking about models and comparing them and seeing how they,
I think if you were the sorts of things a research group would do would be more on the academic side. If you want, obviously this seems like something that could be mature enough to standardize, and that would involve taking it to the IETF and letting them take change control. And I would guess that one of the questions they would ask is, well, how can we interwork the security model of Scion with the security models or lack thereof that we have in the internet. And there's going to be some things which are, I think, clear how to do it, and the standards world can advance that. And there are probably some questions which would be more on the research side, and you'd end up with a bit of activity in both the IETF and the IRTF. But again, that would be evolving what you have in a particular direction versus are you just publishing what you have now as a record of the existing system?
Yeah.
Versus are you just saying, well, you know, we've got what we have and we're happy with it, but there are some open research questions for the next generation of Scion in however many years, which might be a more researchy question. So it really depends where you want to go.
Yeah. So if I summarize what has been said, the two documents, the overview document and the Pki are really describing what is there now. So this would be more appropriate for the independent ISE stream, or what is it, submission, or and what the draft of Nicola's draft is a bit more maybe a bit more how do you say it? It's a bit more mature and is better. Does this better?
Again,
I
think it depends what you want to do with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the draft you have for the PKA now, for example, looks to me, as someone who doesn't really understand PKIs, it looks to me like a perfectly reasonable protocol spec. And you know, if your goal is to document what you have now, then publishing that as an independent stream document would seem like a reasonable thing to do, right? And
okay.
You know, independent stream has done that in a bunch of occasions. You know, company X's protocol to do Y. If the goal is to bring it into the IETF and turn it into a set of standards documents, then that might be a starting point for that process. But what you end up with might look quite different after the IETF process has run. If the goal is to seed some research, then I'm not sure that's quite the right document, because it's focusing on what you have now rather than what are the open questions.
Okay. There are
anyway,
more.
Dustin in the queue, so maybe he has opinion.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that this is not an alternative, right? You can go for an ISE publication of what you have today and still go to the research group and ask for help putting this into a more general, understandable framework. And I haven't read the document, so I don't know whether it's ready for ISE publication, but I think that might be a quite attractive approach, and you can even pursue this in parallel. So there is no need to wait for one to complete to do the other, because the research group can work on the internet draft of the other document.
And it may even be that all three of these happen in parallel, in that, you know, publishing what you have now on the independent stream, while simultaneously saying, okay, there are these bits which are standardizable, which we should try and take into the IETF, and there are these open research questions which we should bring into the groups.
Okay.
You know, it's a question of what are your goals?
Yeah, I think it's clear. Nicola, do you have to add something? Do you want to mention something? You?
Thanks. Right. Sorry, we're in the same room. So yeah, I think the goal, what Colin mentioned, makes a lot of sense. So the goal is definitely to somehow document what is existing, especially because of the existing deployments. That I mean, as we, for example, before we mentioned, there's different PKIs. Some basically is interoperable, but some extensions are not. So clearly defining a boundary there, what is, let's say, the bare minimum, would be very beneficial for those initial deployments. So that would be, I think it would be beneficial to go through the ISE. But as mentioned, this does not exclude continuing the research part, because there is still a lot of research. I mean, also here at ETH, there is a lot of research, and besides that, there's also other people that sometimes join discussions here, mostly at PANRG, but also at other groups, because there's a lot of research on many aspects, for example, transition mechanisms, and so on. And of course, moving into the IETF for bigger standardization work, I think this would also be beneficial because there are some engineering challenges that, I mean, some of them are already addressed with the early deployments, but I'm sure there are more where so far things are not very clearly defined. So I think this would also be very beneficial, but perhaps at a later stage. So I hope that adds something to what we discussed before. I'll leave it to the next in the queue. I think that is Colin.
Are you still, are you? Yeah, go ahead.
That means I forgot to leave the queue.
Great. So it seems like there's 4 documents. This is just me thinking aloud. This is not me with my chair hat on. It seems like there are 4 documents that should go to the ISE. There's the overview, there's the PKI, there's the control plane, and then there's the data plane, right? Like, so those 4 specifications, and those would be sort of like, you know, an exposition on the existing deployments of the Scion internet architecture, right? And that set of 4 documents would form the basis, I think, of everything else that you all want to do in this space, right? Like, so that's, you have a published thing, you can point to it, you have like you're engaging with the outer community and say, these are the things that worked, these are the things that didn't, this is why we built this the way that we did. Those, I think, are going to be very useful regardless of what, like Nicholas said, like there are engineering challenges that would be useful to address in a forum like the IETF. Those are all going to push toward building sort of like interoperable components, like in the component analysis, where you could actually sort of like, you know, I mean, build this into, you know, the actual next internet, right? Which is the long-term goal. I agree with everything that Colin and Karsten said here, that like, you don't have to pick one, but I would also say you have a finite amount of time. And I think probably the place to put the time now would be in refining the documents for ISE publication, like getting something there that you can, like, you know, stick a pin in the sand and say, this is where we are starting. At the same time, with, you know, my PANRG chair hat on, I've heard a few things mentioned here that would be documents that you could start in parallel and start a discussion within this research group. One is like, let's actually explore the space of PKIs and architectures that look like Scion. One is developing a vocabulary that is more precise for dealing with trust and authorization in path-aware networks, right? Like, so I mean, that's even that even like goes directly to a couple of the questions in the foundational document of the thing. And I think it's up to you about, you know, where you want to focus your finite time first versus later. It seems like what I would advise, again, chair hat off, is get the 4 documents into a state where they make sense to send to the ISE first, right? Because that will be the thing that you have that you can show to start all of the conversations in the research group as well as outside the research group.
Thanks. This is really very helpful, I think. I mean, for me, yeah. Thank you very much. And I also, for me, it's also very clear now. I've cleared the different. What is it? The difference between this ISE and also what you in your group would like to see and discuss. That's so definitely the ones, the overview and the control plane PKI are how do you say it, much too plain in a way for your group. I mean, it's just descriptive and not how do you say it, not so much food for thought, you know, like yeah.
Yep. So I think that like something that I've seen, and I see the queue growing, but I am going to address this one first. Sorry, chair's prerogative. A thing that I've seen in the 3 meetings that we've done so far, talking about sort of Scion in general is that like every time we have an overview, there are people engaging in this room saying, that's an interesting research question, that's an interesting research question,
Mhm.
that's an interesting research question. I'm not sure it makes sense to have sort of like the development of these ISE documents be a thing that happens in the research group, right? Because they're like, it's for a different thing.
Mhm.
But I would like to see sort of periodic updates within PANRG on here's what we're working on right now. Because like when that gets presented in this forum, like every time you've brought something here, you've gotten like feedback that I think is useful to the research community and useful to yourselves, right? Like, so I think that this is that part of this interaction is working very well, and I'd like to see that continue. So maybe it's focus a bit on the ISE stuff now, but give presentations about it here. And then we continue having like, I hope that next time we have like slightly more attendance for the interim. I'm a little surprised that we're only 10 today. But
maybe also because PKI is not so path aware. I mean, it's not
yeah,
totally
I mean,
the
and I
core
think
of
that's another
your.
thing is we actually do want to figure out how to like if we want to have those discussions here, and I think that we should, like some of the stuff that Karsten was digging into about, okay, how can we be more precise about how trust and authorization work in networks like this? That's super interesting, right? But I think we need to cast the net a little bit wider. Maybe in London, try to do a very fast presentation on this in the security area open SAG.
Based on
or
what
send
you
stuff out to
say,
the SAG list to say, hey, we're talking about this in PANRG.
yeah. Based on what you say, I think there are two how do you say it? We have the documentation of what is really there and also implemented. So like it, and then there is the what is it? The stream or the how do you say it? The part where we have the more theoretical discussion, which can be held in PANRG. And I guess that this can also be very interesting. Maybe I don't know. I'm really just thinking loud now for PhDs or like people who really do research. So. But we should discuss it with Adrian, of course. How we can streamline or organize this.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Nicola, go ahead. Let me catch up on the notes.
Yeah, I think you already partially answered my question. So it was really about the expectations from PANRG and how we should interact. So I think that is somehow clear. Regarding your next point, you mentioned maybe presenting this somewhere at the security area, or how would this work if we are also perhaps developing something with independent stream? Would it be just presenting, hey, FYI,
like, so basically the thing in SAG would be you basically just show up to the open meeting and you're essentially giving an ad for coming to PANRG, right? It's like saying, hey, we're working on this. There's this document which we're doing to the ISE, but we're having discussions about research questions that this document throws up, right? Like so, and we noticed that PANRG is basically transport and routing geeks, and we need some security geeks in there, right? Like so that's you can send that out to the mailing list as well, right? Like so the idea is that you get some more eyeballs on the drafts that are going to the ISE, right? Like, I mean, those drafts are they're still internet drafts. Anybody can read them, right? But you're being very clear that, hey, no, this is not the start of a standardization process. It might be the basis of future standardization. This is us documenting this for the benefit of future research and future standardization. But here are the documents, and we talk about research questions that might pop up around this in PANRG. Please join us. Right. It's a little bit like, I think you want to send that to the list first because I'm going to be like very adamant that we don't schedule PANRG on Friday. And I think SAG is always on Thursday afternoon, right? Like, so that the timing might not line up right. Yeah, I mean, you can also, like, I've done it before where I go to like TSV area. I'm like, hey, you just missed a great meeting. Please join us in the mailing list. Right, because like I think that one of the things that we should focus on in London is just sort of making sure that the community is built up the right way, so we're going to get the right feedback to figure out what we're going to focus on here in the research group. Karsten.
Yeah, I just wanted to muddy the waters a little by pointing out that the IETF is more than just PANRG. So if we find something here that really can be or should be spun out to something that is focusing on security and authorization and so on, we probably want to discuss this in a larger IETF context. I mean, the result could be that we say, okay, that's still fine to do in PANRG, but that should be the result of a discussion and not just a presumption.
PANRG, I am mortally offended by the idea that there are other research groups, but I agree wholeheartedly with you. Yeah, I think that yeah, I don't want to say yes, we need to bring everybody into PANRG. I want to say more, we need to make sure that we get this in front of the right eyeballs. And I am happy, again, chair hat on, for this to be the default forum for those things. But yeah, I think actually I'm going to call call into the microphone to answer the question of sort of like the best way to engage IRTF wide with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the core of this is a path-aware protocol. So for now, I think PANRG is as good a home for it as any. If the work starts drifting into much broader areas, then we can revisit that in the future. I think right now, if we try and move it to a different home or scatter the work too widely, then we're going to dilute the effort, and we're not currently overflowing with people in this group. So. Custom.
I wasn't talking about moving. So the interesting thing about all these groups we have in the IETF is that they are all very virtual. So it's more like pulling in other groups and making sure their specific expertise on some aspects of this could be used. Obviously, the actual model of players and actors and objectives and so on is very path-aware specific. So PAN will always be an anchor for this activity. I was just pointing out there may be other groups that may have something to contribute here.
Yep, absolutely.
Note taker at the same time, so I'm furiously typing over in the corner. I will continue catching up on that and publish some minutes at the end, but I want to, before going off and doing the closing and giving everybody 32 minutes back, ask if there are any other points of discussion or questions that people would like to raise, or any other questions that the presenters would like to ask the room. Go, Nicola.
So maybe just in view of London, I guess we would just polish a bit the draft. So if there's any feedback, maybe also if people want to share it on the mail list as well, I think this could be a thing. And we could perhaps provide a short update at PANRG just to check. And
yes.
But I think more than that, it would be difficult. We were also thinking to maybe organize something at the hackathon so people could get their hands dirty. But yeah.
I think that actually the way things are going in the IETF now, you might be more successful attracting security geeks to come and have a look at this by having a hackathon table than by showing up at SAG, right? Like, so there's a lot more energy over on the hackathon side of things. So I think that is like very good advice to yourself.
Yeah. All right. Great.
Yeah. Brian?
Yes.
I was not sure, but did you say that the PANRG meeting is likely on Friday in London?
No, it's likely not to be on Friday, because
okay.
I have to if I can make it to London, which is actually not certain right now, then I have to leave on Thursday, and I wouldn't be able to attend remotely Friday in any
okay,
case.
no, that's good to know, because it's more from an organizational point of view. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I will. We don't actually have the request in yet. Actually, one of the things I'm going to do is I give everybody 30 minutes back is take some of that time for myself to actually go make that happen. And I will be, I'll put the please don't put due Friday on there because I would very much like to be able to go chair it. Okay, any other business, questions, comments, concerns? Discussion about the existence of other research groups. Okay, thank you all very much. Thanks to the presenters, thanks to the participants. I will send the minutes out as soon as I finish remembering what was said when I overran them. And we will see hopefully many or all of you in London. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye.